Great. So, thank you to everybody who's joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate your interest. I'm always excited when I can talk about the budget. It's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So, the intention of this presentation is to provide an overview of the city's fiscal year 21 budget, with a specific focus on our general fund. As we go through it, I'd be happy to pause for any questions that anybody might have. And I'll also provide an email address at the end if there's any follow-up questions that you might have. I'll just do a brief introduction of myself. My name is Eric Villamoria. I was hired into the budget office about 5 years ago. For the last 2.5 years, I have served as the budget manager. Um, but prior to that, I managed our capital improvement program. I've led various initiatives in my time here at the city, including the implementation of our priority-based budgeting program. I have about 20 years overall in municipal budgeting experience. And the picture you see on the left is of me and my family. We just bought a new home in Southeast Boise. We got the keys about 3 weeks ago. And this picture was taken on New Keys Day. So you can see everybody was very excited and happy. Um, I'll just set the stage for our overall budget. When you look at the fiscal year 2021 budget, um, it was about $555 million between all funds. You can see the general fund on the right-hand side of the pie chart, making up the majority of that. Included in that 555 million dollar number was also the airport at about 21% of our overall budget. Sometimes people don't really think about the airport as being part of the city, but it most definitely is. And our water renewal fund or our sewer fund at about 16%. You can also see solid waste, so the garbage and recycling service that we all enjoy at about 7%, and then a couple other smaller funds, geothermal and our capital funds represented. When we think about our general fund budget, that's where we fund the majority of our general government services. So think police and fire, parks and library. Our fiscal year 21 budget was just over $238 million. So as we were preparing the fiscal year 21 budget, we had three primary goals in mind, um, beyond the overarching goal of developing a balanced budget. We valued and we placed a lot of importance on protecting our financial resources, especially in this time of uncertainty with COVID. So we worked hard to come up with some expenditure reduction strategies to make sure that we had the ability to respond to the unknown um, uh, by establishing a COVID reserve and then preserving the reserves that we already had in place. We also worked hard to provide property tax relief uh, so we could support community members who are struggling and have been struggling with that important topic. And I'll provide more information on property tax in a moment. And then there were some targeted investments included in the fiscal year 21 budget, including support for our vulnerable community members, and then key investments in areas such as housing, accessibility, transportation, and climate innovation. So, some overall themes that we've been experiencing within the general fund, and I touched on this on the last slide, really economic uncertainty, reduced growth, and escalating costs. So, it's a little bit of a difficult time right now, most definitely exacerbated by the challenges associated with COVID-19. As part of this budget, and we expect this trend to continue, definitely over the next year and probably into the future, we expect some downward pressure on some of our major revenue sources. So property tax is within the general fund the largest revenue source, represents about two-thirds of our overall general fund budget. And as part of this budget that we just entered into just about 3 weeks ago, there was 0% base growth built in for property tax. That's in contrast to the 3% allowable growth per state statute, which would have yielded an additional 4.8 million for the general fund. However, the mayor and the city council, uh, to comport with that goal that I discussed earlier, built in 0% to recognize some of the struggles that folks are experiencing. Sales tax is one of our other major categories, and we expect sales tax to see some downward pressure, not only because of the COVID-19 recession and issues surrounding that, but also um, due to some state legislation, which will uh, cap our growth to some extent and I guess, divert some statewide sales tax collections to other portions of the state. Overall, the general fund budget for this upcoming year was about 1.1% lower than the prior fiscal year. We're also seeing increasing costs, and I'll touch on what we're doing to address that as we go through the deck here. Um, so we see our existing services increasing, the cost of people, which represents the largest portion of our general fund expenditure budget, and then other items like insurance and supplies and software and other things like that. We're experiencing growth in our city, and that's also translating to our budget. So as we add assets to support the growing community, such as parks, we need to ensure that we are maintaining those parks. Similar with fire stations, we add a fire station or we project to add a fire station. Not only do we have the construction cost associated with that fire station, but we have the ongoing expense to actually staff and operate it. We also added new police officers as part of the fiscal year 21 budget, and that's been an ongoing approach to ensure that we can keep up with the increasing population. Finally, service expansion. Uh, the city has made targeted investments in public transportation, affordable housing, and some environmental measures in recent years as well. As we look at the general fund revenues in total for fiscal year 21, you can see, as I mentioned, property tax on that pie chart representing just over 2/3 of our overall revenues. Um, Sales tax and department revenue, which I'll go into in a moment, being our next largest categories. And you can see on the table to the right of the pie chart, um, are reductions year over year in our revenue categories. You can see development tax, sales tax, with some fairly hefty declines built in as part of this budget. Similarly, with fines and forfeitures and our franchise fees. Um, the property tax, I want to elaborate on a little bit. I mentioned 0% base growth, and that is definitely the case. That 1.6% property tax growth represents taxes assessed to new construction and annexation. So it's primarily due to new construction. So as new homes are built, new businesses are constructed, um, that becomes taxable, and the city has chosen to uh, assess taxes to those new buildings when they come online to ensure that we can keep up with growth and to ensure that we can add those services that come along with an increasing population. Notable liquor tax is the category that we have not seen a decline in, nor do we expect to see a decline. That category has held up remarkably well in these trying times. So, some overall themes around property tax. I'll dwell on that one for a minute. I did mention it's the largest revenue source. What we've seen over the last really several years is a trend of the overall burden for property tax is shifting, and that burden is shifting from the residential community to the residential community from commercial, and that's not a conscientious choice by the city. That's a product of really a couple of things. One, which is the diminishing value of the homeowner's exemption, and we've seen, escalation in prices over the last several years, and the homeowner's exemption was capped at $100,000 about 3 years ago. And what that means, in tandem with uh, the rate of increase, is more and more and more of our homes is exposed to property taxes. We've also seen an increasing rate of increase for residential versus commercial properties. Um, there has been some legislation that's been discussed around this topic. It's an issue that the city takes very seriously and would like to see some level of property tax reform to address some of the issues that our community members have felt. Um, there is a property tax interim committee which is meeting at the state legislature level. Their last meeting was this past Friday, and they are working to come up with different solutions to address property taxes. There were a number of different proposals on the table as part of fiscal year uh, 2020, I guess, really the past legislative session, which went from January to March of this calendar year. Um, None of those went through. There are certain ideas which the city would prioritize over others. Um, so, as this property tax interim committee is meeting, we are most definitely trying to provide our input as to what we think the most meaningful um, solutions would be to this issue. We do expect that there will be continued downward pressure on property tax, even this upcoming fiscal year, um, both due to the COVID recession and recovery. Also, because and you may have read about this or heard about it, the city is participating in a property tax relief program that was uh, that was offered by the state using coronavirus relief funds to offset property tax. Uh, and the way that program works is the state is reimbursing the city for eligible public safety expenses in exchange for providing property tax relief. So the good news is that when we see our property tax bills that will be sent next month from the county, they will be lower than they otherwise would have been, uh, which is excellent news for the community. We will see, on a year-over-year basis as that program expires, um, year-over-year changes, which I think will, place some downward pressure on the levy rate for next fiscal year. So there, I mentioned a couple slides ago the 1.6% that the city has built in associated with new construction and growth. And you can see on this slide some trends as it relates to new construction. You can see on the left-hand side of this slide, really the tail end of the period before the Great Recession, where growth was relatively high. And then you can see the Great Recession years where there was a pretty significant dip. Um, and then there was a recovery over the last several years. Leading up to fiscal year 2019. Fiscal years 20 and forward, we've built in a decline. And I'm going to be rude for one moment. I got to plug in my computer. I was about to lose power there. I apologize. So you can see that in fiscal year 21, we've built in 1.6%. In future years, as we are in this recession and the impacts of that linger, we would expect lower levels of new construction growth, which would translate to lower levels of property tax. As we look at sales tax has been another category that has seen declines. um, in the forecast. Um, we were seeing year over year increases. You can see pretty steady increases from 2010 through 2019. The 2020 budget, we built in something a little bit lower, and 21, yeah, an even lower amount. And the rate of growth that we've built um, in future years is reflective of some legislation that the council, excuse me, that the state legislature approved as part of their past legislative session. Development fees, and what we mean by development fees are fees that are paid um, at the time of development for plan review and inspection services. Um, Development fees, we anticipate a pretty significant drop off from fiscal year 2020 into the current fiscal year, a drop off of about 13.5%. Um, this category is historically one of our more volatile revenue categories, and we anticipate that it will take a little bit of time for us to even regain to where we were a few years ago. Um, so that's one that we'll be hoping for improvement in the economy, so we can see some increased collections in that area. And really, before I go back, the importance of increased collections here is not so much on the city's budget, but it's a reflection of the health of the overall community. Property tax, I won't dwell on this one too much, but we've seen pretty steady growth, and we anticipate that steady growth to continue in the coming years. And then franchise fees has been a category that's been relatively steady, and we expect that steadiness to continue. So departmental revenue is kind of a catch-all category. But what I mean when I say departmental revenue is it's revenues that are associated with specific services within the departments, and they're not general fund or general revenues like a general tax which the city receives. And most of these revenues are associated with an expense or a service that's provided to specific members of the community or to specific user groups. So you can see that the largest amount of the $27.5 million that's budgeted in this upcoming fiscal year are for public safety contracts. So the city provides police and fire services on behalf of a couple of different fire districts, North Ada County and Whitney. Um, we provide policing services at the airport. We provide policing services at Boise State. All of those expenses are reimbursed to the general fund, and that makes up that 53%. Other revenue categories, departmental revenue categories include golf. That's about 11%. So we own and operate two golf courses, Warm Springs and Quail Hollow. Idaho Ice World, aquatics at 2%. Parking is a category that we built in approximately 9% of that $27.7 million of revenue in. That's one that we're most definitely going to have to watch. And if this COVID event, continues the way it is, we might need to adjust our revenue estimates for that category. I'll speak a little bit about our expenditures. Our expenses in the general fund are equal to our revenues at $238.7 million. Whereas the majority of our revenues were in property tax, the majority of our expenses are personnel related people. And I can show on a subsequent slide where those people largely are. The other 30% of our general fund budget, about half of it is for maintenance and operations. And I like to think of those as just our non-personnel type expenses, supplies, fuel, insurance, professional services, things of that nature. We have some contingencies. We do a transfer to our capital fund and to our debt service fund. We make a pretty significant contribution to Valley Regional Transit to provide public transportation within the city, and that represents about 3% of our overall budget. So as we look at how tax resources are allocated, you can see the bottom portion of this pie chart, uh, with police and fire being the largest slices of the pie. About 50.5 cents out of every dollar goes to police and fire. Um, our Parks and Recreation department at about 12%. Transfers that we make to our capital fund and to our debt service fund to support capital projects in the future, and those previously constructed represent about 7%. Our library, about 6 cents on the dollar. Contractual services, which is that VRT contribution for public transportation. It's our contribution to the Idaho Humane Society and to the Allen House and for our courts, representing about 5 cents on the dollar, and all of our other departments representing about 20 cents on the dollar. So, as part of the fiscal year that we're in, there were a number of expenditure adjustments which were recommended and approved by the City Council. Those include, on the reduction side, an adjustment to how we budget for personnel. We went uh, went through our budget with a fine tooth comb and budgeted at a much more granular level than we had in the past, which resulted in approximately $1 million in budgetary savings. We also went through every single department and did a historical analysis to determine where we're spending money and opportunities to save relative to the budget. And as a result of that exercise, we reduced budget by about $1.4 million. The mayor and city council approved a reduced rate of compensation growth for our city employees. Um, that action is anticipated to save about $2.2 million as part of this budget, and those reductions would be ongoing. And then there was a $2 million reduction target for various programs. Uh, a good chunk of that was identified, but a good chunk still is to be developed prior to the end of the year. So there are numerous reduction strategies which the city is actively working on. On the expense increase side, there was some limited normal growth. So, you can see salaries and benefits listed there. That number is significantly lower than it otherwise would have been because of that reduction strategy on the left-hand slide. There were some limited non-personnel increases. Most areas were held flat or even reduced. In areas such as software maintenance and insurance, we did see some increases, largely outside of the city's control. There were some citywide and departmental strategic investments, uh, you know, either to fortify services, to address workload demands, or to advance key initiatives like homelessness within the city. Uh, the city council, in their wisdom, put a $2.5 million reserve into fiscal year 2021 to respond to any issues that may arise due to COVID-19. So that reserve could be for uh, bringing down our revenue estimates or for increased costs. So, as part of the year that we just exited, there were a number of costs, if you think support services for our vulnerable community members, cleaning services, and things of that nature. Many of those, which were reimbursed through federal proceeds in the calendar year that we're in, but we have no such assurances that any of those expenses, should they continue, would be reimbursed next year. So that's what that reserve could be used for. And then I mentioned departmental workload. There were very few specific adjustments which were recommended. There was a bucket of resources which was included as part of the 21 budget for potential adjustments, but we're waiting to see how some of those other savings initiatives end the year before we make any specific recommendations to utilize that funding. This slide just kind of provides an overview of the different categories where expenditure adjustments were built into fiscal year 21. You can see it was a fairly balanced approach. Um, Environment and climate innovation, accessibility, public safety, transportation, that COVID reserve. There was numerous adjustments in lots of different areas that were made, uh, all of which, in total were offset by reduction strategies. Looking to the future, there are a number of items that the city will be tasked with finding budget for. As we continue to grow, we'll likely need to continue adding police officers. Um, a new station in the northwest area of the city would require some capital investment as well as some operating dollars. As we add new parks, we have been adding parks in response to growth and to catch up with some backlog. We will have parks maintenance costs. The city has prioritized, affordable housing through our Grow Our Housing initiative, and as part of that, land purchases and incentives will be required. There's the potential to grow our public transportation system. Uh, Interesting on our fire stations, I think that Northwest Station is the last station that we might need to build in the immediate future. But as we look across the inventory of our various fire stations, there are improvements that need to be made to modernize them. And many of our stations are approaching 30 and 40 and 50 years. So some of those modernizations and upgrades we'll need to address. The city is looking to make some energy initiatives or to advance some energy initiatives. We have some major repairs and maintenance activities to work through. Modernizing and upgrading some of our parks assets, addressing ADA repairs. As the city grows, and becomes more complex, we need to make sure that we, are adequately, staffing our human resources department, our legal department, our IT department, so on and so forth. And then looking at, limited market rate adjustments for general employees where necessary. Those conclude my prepared remarks. I will, be happy to stand for any questions, and I'll leave this slide up as we go through it. If there's any questions that anybody might have, uh, and might not be comfortable or might want to have, something specifically explained to them, I'd be very happy to do that. I love talking about the budget, as I mentioned. You can reach me at this address, budget@cityofboise.org. So with that, I'll open it up for anybody that might have any questions. I'm looking on the app and I don't see any that have come through so far. I'm not sure that there's any in the chat feature either. That might be it, unless I'm missing anything. If that's the case, I really appreciate everybody's participation and expressing interest in learning about the budget.